Welcome to the Live Like It's True podcast, where we look at some of the most interesting and surprising stories of the Bible and ask, how can we live like this story is true? I'm Shannon Popkin. I'm an author, a speaker, and Bible teacher. And here on the podcast, I'm inviting you to drink deeply of the true story of the Bible and live like it's true. I'm so excited to tell you about 2 books I have launching this spring, and I'll be hosting a podcast series to go with each. In the Sarah series, we'll look at the life of Sarah, found in Genesis 12 through 21, which is the topic of my new Bible study with Our Daily Bread titled Shaped by God's Promises, Lessons from Sarah on Fear and Faith. I love this story of the Bible, and I can't wait to dive in with you both on the pages of this book and then here on the podcast. My second book launching is Comparison Girl for Teens, published by Kriegel and co-authored with my dear friend Lee Nienhuis. We poured our hearts into this fun-filled, truth-packed resource that we know is going to help so many teens find freedom from comparison. So here on the podcast, we'll be doing the comparison series, and we'll look at how Jesus compared in a completely different way. I hope that each one of these conversations will inspire you to better know the story, share the story, and live like the story is true. Cheryl Lutz, welcome to Live Like It's True.
Thank you so much for having me, Shannon.
Yeah, it's such a blessing to be with you. I think we first met at the Speak Out conference. Is that correct?
That is correct. Correct. Yes.
And then we ran into each other at the Revive Our Hearts conference. So we have some similar groups that we're part of. And you are an international speaker, a lay counselor, a pastor's wife, and a recovering people pleaser. I can relate.
Yes.
And you have a new book coming out, Securely Held, Finding Significance and Security in the Shelter of God's Embrace. So we're excited about that. Is this your first book, Cheryl?
It is.
Oh.
Felt the call 11 years ago, and it's finally happening. So God is faithful.
Praise God. And you've been married to Alan for 34 years.
Yes.
4 adult children, and you're part of the North Georgia area, right?
We are.
I love Georgia. So Cheryl, is this story that we're going to be talking about, is this part of your book?
Yes, we deal with Moses in the book. He's in 3 different chapters. So we do have the who am I when God calls him to save the Israelites.
Yeah.
And there is the chapter with Jochebed as his mother and releasing him and how that related to my life and the who am I, understanding my identity by finding out who is God.
Yeah.
And then the Jochebed and releasing one of our sons.
So, Cheryl, have any of your babies ever been threatened?
Yes. Our first birth went very smoothly, but our second child, things started off smoothly, and then things got a bit frantic in the labor and delivery room as they lost his heartbeat. And I wasn't sure what was going on because they were turning the monitors around and giving me oxygen and not really telling me what was happening.
Oh.
So I was definitely feeling some panic, but thankfully the doctor came and he was born quickly. Then at that point, water broke and things sped up, and he was completely blue when he came out. And the cord was around his neck and in a knot, and the knot was actually more dangerous. So if the labor had been longer, that just continues to pull and they can't breathe. But we were very grateful that there were no lasting consequences of that.
Oh, I'm so glad. You know, babies are so helpless.
Exactly.
And having their life threatened as moms, like, I can't think of anything worse. You know, it's like usually when our adult children have things they're going through, like they're playing a part in some role, but as children, like, we're the ones who God has designed to protect and provide for and keep safe. And so the story we're going to look at has a baby whose life is being threatened. and that baby is Moses. Let's just back up before we dive in. We're going to be talking about Exodus 2, the story of Moses being drawn out of the bulrushes. And let's just set up the backdrop here. So the story of the Bible really centers in on one family. It's the family of Abraham. And even if we go back to Adam and Eve, the great problem of the Bible is sin. When Adam and Eve sinned, sin entered the world, and that has created death and destruction. And so right after that happened, God promised that the seed of the woman would crush this serpent who has tempted mankind into sin. So as we turn the pages of Genesis, we're looking, okay, which child born to a woman is going to be the one who will rise up and crush death? Well, then we get a little further into Genesis 12, and we're told, oh, it's going to be one of Abraham's children. Abraham is the selected man that God has chosen from his family. God says, I will make of you a great nation, and your seed, one of your children, is the one that kind of ties back to that promise in Genesis. So we're just kind of reading through Genesis, waiting for this child to be born into Abraham's family, the beginning of Exodus. You know, Joseph is sold into slavery, brought to Egypt, and there's a famine.
Yes.
And then God uses Joseph. There were 70 of them, and they came, and Joseph gave them the best part of the land, which was Goshen. And so that's where they've been living and multiplying like crazy. And then at the beginning of Exodus, we have a new Pharaoh in place. This one doesn't know Joseph. So there's no treaty between them. There's no understanding of peace. This new Pharaoh's concerned about population. It's gotten out of control. So he's worried. I think it says in the beginning of chapter 1, in verse 9, it says that this Pharaoh is saying to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we are. Come, let's deal shrewdly with them. Otherwise, they will multiply further. And when war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. He first turns them into slaves, and that doesn't work. So then he comes up with this plan, something to do with the boy babies. What's going on here, Cheryl?
They were to be thrown into the Nile, and at birth, he did not want the male children to continue to populate and grow.
Yeah. If you get rid of all the boys, eventually you thin the population. You know, even for a short period of time, if there are no boys, like that really has an impact ultimately on population. I just found an article that says that in the US, we have a record low fertility rate of 1.64 children per woman in the US. In 2020, the pandemic seems to have accelerated this decline, but it's a trend. Experts start getting nervous when you drop below 2.1, because in order to repopulate ourselves, we have to hit a birth rate of 2.1, and we're below that. And so there comes a point where you can't reverse it. I mean, Pharaoh obviously knows that. He's trying to take care of this problem of the slave group is bigger than the ones who are trying to manage the slaves.
Yeah.
He's feeling uncomfortable, but God is the one who makes babies, right?
Yes.
God is the one who oversees population. Moses is born into this situation. I mean, can you imagine? They're slaves. This evil king is out to kill their babies. I can't imagine as a mom giving birth, you know, how much fear and trembling that would create in my life. So that's what Moses is being born into. So Cheryl, could you read Exodus 2:1-4?
Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch, and she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood by at a distance to know what would be done to him.
So this is a great story. I mean, on Live Like It's True, we like to look at the narratives of the Bible, and this one is a good one. You know, who's the bad guy in the story, Cheryl? We've already said
Pharaoh.
And what's the tension here?
This mother's heart of the command. Is she going to obey the law of the land or preserve this child? Because this child has a calling on its life. What's she going to do? Just one brave mother.
Yes, she's so brave. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
She hid him. We're celebrating here that she didn't obey. But in a sense, she kind of did, because Pharaoh said to throw the babies into the Nile River. And to some extent, she
did.
If you look at it literally, she has thrown him in. But I mean, I just can't imagine those first 3 months trying to keep a baby quiet for 3 months. You know, I imagine they have guards walking down the streets and, oh my goodness.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever tried to keep a baby quiet?
Well, my husband was a pastor for 30 years and having the baby in church, you know, I didn't want the baby louder than my husband who's trying to preach. And so, yeah.
I never tried. I just always was like, I'll just go out.
Right.
My babies were all noisy. They were just not good at staying quiet. And I can't imagine trying to keep him hidden. And then I wonder, was she expected to work? How did she do that? And did people cover for each other? It must have been terrorizing that any moment your baby could cry and he could just be taken from you and thrown in the river. Awful. And what, you know, in the river, there are crocodiles. Terrible, terrible scene. So then she can't hide him any longer. So then what does she come up with?
She's going to put him in this basket and put him in the water, release him into God's care. You know, when it said she saw that he was a fine child, so she hid him. And I know, Shannon, I know you have boys also. I have 2 sons. So what mother doesn't think that her son is a fine child?
I had that same thought. Like, this is all women right here.
Right.
You know, this is every mother who thinks her baby is a fine child. Of course, no baby is not a fine child to his mom.
Exactly. But there was something special about this child, you know, in God's sovereignty. He was chosen and set apart, and Jochebed somehow knew that.
Yeah.
Putting together this basket out of the bulrushes, which would have been like pliable plants from the Nile, and making this basket. And they said the word for the basket is the same word used for the ark, Noah's ark. And so it was like this little ark that he was put in and preserved.
Yeah, that's so cool, isn't it? And this word is used a bunch of times in Genesis, you know, when we had the story of Noah and the ark. It's the only other time this word is used. So what are the parallels here between this story and Noah's ark?
We see God preserving Noah and his family. Mm-hmm. Through the floods and in the water, through this ark that he built, and his sovereign hand closing the door itself, and then his preserving Moses in this little ark in the water and being drawn out to safety.
Yeah, I love that. There's this image of someone going into the ark. There's water on the outside, and God is sovereignly protecting and caring for. But then I also love the fact that she put her daughter to keep watch over baby brother. Jochebed's family is exactly like my family. It goes girl, boy, boy. Our girl, Lindsay, she was like mom number 2.
Oh, right.
We were just having a conversation with her brother the other day, and she said she stopped bossing them when she got so sick of them calling her mom.
Oh, there you go.
How does your family go, Cheryl?
Yes, I have girl, boy, girl, boy.
Okay, so you have an oldest girl too.
Exactly.
They're really good at mommying, aren't they?
They are. And it's kind of comical as they get older, and then your older kids are such excellent parents of the younger ones. You're like, oh, really?
And we don't know how old Miriam is. That's Moses' older sister, but she's the one standing watch. I mean, that's a lot for a little girl too.
Yes.
It says at a distance. So maybe she hid just to keep an eye on the basket. I mean, and for some reason, Jochebed, it was maybe too risky for her to be there. We don't know. We're not told. But for some reason, she had to be even further away.
Yes.
And her daughter is at a distance. Nobody is within close proximity to this baby. That is terrifying.
Right.
There's an evil king out to get him. There's crocodiles. She has to put him in a basket, float him in the river. She's made it waterproof. She's done everything she can. What parallel do you see there between what all moms have to do? Moms who trust that God is in control, but yet have to do our part. What balance do you see there, Cheryl?
Yeah, I mean, we have to, whether they're an infant or an adult, they're still our child, as you know, but we've got to release. What are we responsible for, and what is God responsible for? And absolutely train them, teach them the word of God, pray over them. You know, salvation is of the Lord. We can't change their hearts, we can put it before them and all those different things, whether it's spiritual safety or physical safety.
Yeah.
We have to release that.
Yeah, I love that you segmented those out, spiritual and physical safety. And I think we have to deal with both of those as moms, right? Physical safety. You already shared a story where your baby was blue. You had done everything you could. Like pregnancy is one of those things that we really, we eat, we sleep, and God does the rest. Like he grows this baby inside of us. We can do our best with good nutrition and sleep, and that's about all we can do. And then it's like putting that baby in the basket. So I have a son who's allergic to bees. We didn't know that. He came in one day. I was laying down on the couch taking a little nap, and he's like, Mom, I think I stepped on some bees. And I'm like, okay, are you okay? And he's like, I don't know. I feel a little itchy. I look up and his face is swelling.
Oh, goodness.
And there were a whole bunch of bees that he'd been stung by. And so I'm like, oh no. So I'm like going through the cupboard, trying to find Benadryl. I didn't have any. So I'm like, let's go to Rite Aid. I'm running in Rite Aid. I need Benadryl. And his body is swelling, like his eyes are swelling, his mouth. And, so they're like, you need to bring him to an ER immediately. So get behind the wheel. And I am panicking at this point, Cheryl.
Yes.
And I went the wrong way. In my panic, I went the wrong way to the med center. And I'm just like terrified, as his body is swelling. He's starting to panic too. So we run into this med center. I'm like, he needs a doctor. And they're like, send him right back. Oh, I think within 1 minute, they had a shot of epinephrine in his leg, and immediately things started to calm. So like, I look at that story, I did my part. It would have been foolish for me to say, well, let's just pray that God will reverse the effects of these bee stings. Like, that's not what we're saying when we say, put God in control. We do what we can as mothers, It was right for me to get behind that wheel. And sometimes we make mistakes. I went the wrong way. We are frail, but we do what we can. We try to keep our children safe, but ultimately, we put those children in God's hands.
Absolutely.
And that's what Jochebed's doing. She's done what she can here. She's created this little ark for safety. She's placed her older child to watch over. And perhaps she even has a plan. She might know that this is where Pharaoh's daughter goes to bathe. She might, maybe that's common knowledge, and maybe only women are allowed in that area. I could see that being the case. We don't know. This might be her ingenuity, but ultimately she has surrendered this child to God, hasn't she? What are you waiting on God for? And which promises of God apply to you during this long stretch of waiting? My free Pray God's Promises prayer guide will help you sort out which promises are for here and now and which ones apply to you later. When you pray the promises found in your Bible, this is one of the ways that God shapes you by his promises. For your free prayer guide, use the link in the show notes or go to shannonpopkin.com/promises, where you can also learn more about my brand new Bible study with Our Daily Bread titled Shaped by God's Promises, Lessons from Sarah on Fear and Faith.
Yes, absolutely. It's like you said, she can't control crocodiles or who finds him.
Yeah. But then also spiritually, I like that you segmented those out. We have to put our children in God's hands spiritually. I was looking through this text one more time. God's name isn't mentioned here in this text, and nor is the enemy mentioned here, but there's this spiritual battle going on. If we back up and look at this overarching story of God's people, there are a lot of people trying to kill them. Can you even think of all the times when somebody's out to get the people of Israel?
There's so many. Yes.
There's famine at first, like right after God calls Abraham and Sarah, they're faced with famine. They're going to die. They have to go to Egypt. This is the first time they're kind of targeted by someone, like Pharaoh's targeting this specific race of people. And by the way, throughout the Bible, they're called the Hebrew people, they're called the nation of Israel, and they're called the Jewish people. It's kind of confusing, and I won't go into why they're called what, when, but it's all the same family group. It's the same nationality, and they're targeted. Do you remember the story of Esther when Haman wants to wipe out all of the Jews?
All of the Jews. He wants to annihilate them.
Yeah, and then remember when Jesus was a baby, what happened then?
Herod, when he found out that there's this king born somewhere, and so he tells the wise wise men to report back and, where is this child? And when they don't, he says all children 2 years and younger to be murdered. Very similar.
I think it's all the boys again.
Yes, the boys 2 years and younger. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a parallel story.
Mhm.
Look who they're after at that point. They're after Jesus.
Yes.
In that story, Herod wants to kill Jesus, this new king, our king. But I look back at this story and I think the same thing is happening.
Absolutely.
I mean, as we're turning the pages, asking, okay, who's the seed of the woman who's going to crush the serpent? Well, then the serpent is rising up and working through evil people, trying to wipe out this nation. Like that is the main conflict of the Old Testament. Well, I would say that and bringing them into the promised land. But it's like, is this line of people, are they going to survive? And is this promised one going to be born? And so if you wipe out the Hebrew people at this point, you don't get this line leading to Jesus. And so God is going to be the one to protect. And he's going to start with this little Moses. He's going to be drawn out of this little basket. Before we go to the next part of the story, I just want to look at verse 6. So this is Pharaoh's daughter. She's coming to bathe by the river with her young women. She sees the basket among the reeds. She sends one of her servants to open it, and then she opens it, and it's like, behold. That's such a storytelling word. It says, behold, the baby was crying. The CSB version says, and there he was, a little boy. It's like, there's this tension, like, what's going to happen to this baby? And then here's a woman who can do something about the problem, just happens to be walking by. What do you see in that part of the story?
So we can say, okay, so she was a woman, so she had pity on this child, or like you said, or is this God's sovereignty? And God's sovereignty is working through the pity of this woman.
Yes.
And one of the commentators was saying, if this were just the pity, if this were just, this coincidence that she wants to keep him, if we take out the miracle side, then it's just a fun fable and story to tell our children, like make believe. If we don't see the sovereign hand of God in this, over Pharaoh's daughter, over Jochebed, over Miriam, all of this, preserving him in the little ark.
This is perhaps some ingenuity, like we've said, but no, this is God's sovereign hand protecting this baby. He's got people behind enemy lines that he can use for his purposes. God does. This woman is on the enemy lines. She's the daughter of this evil king who's trying to wipe out this baby. God is not bound by evil kings. And I see some irony here too. Here's the mighty Pharaoh. I mean, this is the most powerful nation in the world, where other nations are terrorized by Pharaoh. And here are some women, a mother, a daughter from his own household, and a young girl, Miriam, and a baby. And this is this is God's plan. Moses is the one who's going to rise up and bring down the mighty Egypt. This is not a plan that anybody could have hatched. Right?
Absolutely not.
This whole nation is in a situation where there's slavery. There's nothing they can do to break free from the rule of this evil king. But God has a plan, and it starts with a mom having a baby and a little girl keeping watch and a princess from behind enemy lines. I mean, there's some irony for you.
Absolutely. Moses, this child, becoming the adopted grandson of the man who wants him dead, who was killing his people. It's just amazing.
It is. Yeah. What we see about God here is like his purposes will not be thwarted. His purposes will stand. His sovereign hand is devising our salvation. Like he's saving this little boy through this princess, but he's saving us through the line of Abraham's people, the people of Israel. All right, so let's go ahead and read that next part of the story, 7 through 10.
Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water.
So she's going to adopt him.
Yeah.
This princess is going to adopt him. But okay, so let's start with Miriam. I mean, this scene amazes me. I mean, well played, little Miriam. Well
Right?
played. Verse 4 says, and his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. So she's keeping watch. Can you imagine how her heart must have started pounding when she sees, okay, here's Pharaoh's daughter. And oh, they're picking him up. That's her baby brother.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't know if this was part of the plan or if she came up with this, but some ingenuity on her part too, right, Cheryl?
Sure. And just her composure to be able to do it.
Yes.
Myself as a child, I feel like I just would have been shaking. And even if they told me what to say, just suddenly my mind going blank.
Yes. Yeah. I remember you saying when you were a little girl, I read this in your book, that you were just terrorized of being called on in class and not being able to find your words.
Yes.
I mean, this was some composure here from little Miriam, however old she was. I'm picturing like 10 or 12. I don't know where I'm getting that from, but that's what I'm picturing.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't give it away that she's the sister. She doesn't give it away that she's going to go call the mother of this baby.
Mm-hmm.
She looks at it from Pharaoh's daughter's perspective. This is royalty. She has all the power here, but she comes along like, how can I be of help to you? How can I present an idea that's going to be useful to you? Shall I go and call a nurse from the Hebrew woman to nurse this child instead of saying, that's my baby brother and I'll go get my mom like that?
Right.
Yes. So I don't know if there's some foresight here on Jochebed coaching her. I mean, we know that Miriam is going to be one of the leaders of God's people. You know, it says in Exodus that Moses, Aaron, and Miriam led the people out of Egypt. You know, I think those strengths, those leadership skills, we're seeing those in her as a little girl. And how does Pharaoh's daughter then respond?
She says, yes, I will pay this Israelite woman to nurse him until he's ready, and then I will take him. Yeah.
Isn't that so cool?
Yes.
She's paid for the privilege of nursing her baby, her own baby.
We just see the mercy of God there, just giving her that.
Yeah.
Have you ever wondered what your pastor thinks or talks about behind closed doors? Well, at Live Leadership, you get to hear lead pastor Ryan Kimmel and me, executive pastor John Delger, talk about some of the leadership issues that we're facing live and right now. We don't promise to have all the answers, but we promise to try to process and think through all the issues that we're facing as leaders in a local church. You can tune into Live Leadership at resoundmedia.cc or wherever you find podcasts.
It's so beautiful. I mean, I think so many times we're in these hopeless situations, and we're just like, I don't know what to do. I'm stuck. And there are solutions that we can't even imagine. This whole tension of trying to control everything versus surrendering to God. You know, in my book, Control Girl, I was consistently calling us back to like, there's two categories in life, what I can control and what I cannot control. Here's what I can control. In this story, what Jochebed could control is keeping her baby quiet till 3 months, then she can't control it anymore.
Yep.
Creating a basket and then putting him in it, putting her daughter posted nearby to keep watch. That's what she can control. The outcomes are out of her control. And yet God shows himself to be sovereign.
Mm-hmm.
And again, he's so creative. This idea of watching from a distance, you know, Miriam was watching from a distance. I see that in Hagar's story too, when she puts her child under the bush and she's a bow shot away and there's nothing she can do. Her child is dying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she's done everything she can.
Food's gone, water's gone.
Yes. But in that story, what I love is that, you know, Hagar's wailing, but God hears the voice of Ishmael, who's got to be not very loud. He's dying of thirst.
Right.
God hears his voice and he's close enough to hear. So like for the mom who feels like they're at a distance and they can't help, what encouragement do you give them, Cheryl, about God's sovereignty?
Really living like it's true, as you say, that he is at work behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So much of the time we can't see it because we're called to walk by faith and not by sight.
Yeah.
We've got to step back and believe that he is who he says he is and that he will accomplish what he says he will accomplish.
Yeah. And he's nearer than we think.
Yes.
Like we said, God's name is not mentioned in this story. And yet I believe his hand is directing all of these details. Sometimes do you look back at the stories in your life and you're like, oh my goodness, God really was managing all of these details.
Yes. So much of the time I think about the messy middle where, later in life when Moses murders someone and goes off for 40 years, that's the messy middle. Okay, God did this amazing thing and he preserved his life. He must be the promised deliverer of the people. And then he's gone. And that messy middle, are we going to continue to trust
Right.
God's at work behind the scenes when we can't see it?
Yeah. So often we are in a situation where we just can't see how God could ever
Yeah.
turn it out. I mean, I have half a dozen people in my life right now where they're just saying it's hopeless. And oftentimes with our children,
Oh, yeah.
there's a distance. I've done everything I can. I taught them, I've given them God's word, but there's so much I cannot do. And yet God is nearer than we realize. And he sees and he does care. I can imagine 400 years, I think, have gone by while these people have been in slavery. I don't know exactly where the timeline is, but I can imagine them feeling like God has forgotten them.
Oh, yeah. You feel that way. We feel that way after a day. Our sin nature pops up and years, like you said, over 300 years.
Yeah.
Okay, God made this promise. Where is it?
And Jochebed is still operating, I believe, out of faith here. Like even after hundreds of years, just think about how many grandmothers back have been slaves in Egypt at this point in Jochebed's story. And yet she's still remembering God.
Yeah.
And she sees a purpose in her child. She's floating him down the river and putting him in God's hands. Have you ever had to do that with one of your kids, put them in God's hands?
Yes, we have one of our adult kids who struggled with addiction, and there's nothing that makes you feel more powerless when you love someone who is caught in addiction. What I realized through the story and what Jochebed must have realized, God was at work in Jochebed's life. So I kept thinking of what God was doing or was going to do in this adult child. He was doing a work in my heart through it. He was doing a work in my husband's heart through it. He was doing it in our hearts together. It wasn't just about the one with the addiction, but being able to come to the point of releasing and trusting God and letting go of that. I didn't think that I could have joy. I didn't think that I could be happy when one of my kids was not right with God or with even functioning well in society, but learning that, yes, we can have joy and much sorrow at the same time.
Yeah. Our joy isn't contingent on our plans turning out the way we hoped. And with addiction, we feel so powerless. It feels so powerful. It's like the Pharaoh in our lives where we're like, it's got all the power. And any moment now, this Pharaoh addiction thing is going to impose on my child. I see this helpless child at the mercy. And yet there's another person in the story. It's God. My children do have an evil ruler who would like to destroy them. Each of our children. This world is a dangerous place. Sometimes we protect them physically. Other times, all we can do is call for God's spiritual protection through prayer. I think prayer is one of our greatest works. Like that's putting my child in that little ark day by day, putting them in the ark, putting them in the ark, putting them in the ark and letting them go. Prayer is my gritty uphill work of surrender to God. That's prayer and surrendering them to God, but recognizing he is able. He is the one directing this scene in his story with a princess who has compassion. She's like, oh, this must be one of the Hebrew children. She picks him up and then well played Miriam, want me to get one of the women. Jochebed gets to nurse him. And then look at in verse 9. So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter and he became her son. She has this baby for an extended period of time, which tells me, eventually we see in his story that he identifies with God's people. That's what Hebrews calls out as his faith, is that he identified with God's people who were in slavery rather than enjoying the pleasures of Pharaoh's household. So something happened in their home while Moses was a little boy. He was given God's story. He was given God's purposes. He was given God's promises.
Yes.
As a little one. And that meant something to him. Those sank deep in his heart. Do you believe little children can get a grasp on God's story, Cheryl?
Absolutely. Their hearts are so open. And that's why Jesus said, let the little children come to me. That's why they call it a childlike faith. And when you see the beauty of that, and I saw that in our adult son as a child, and then when they stray, you have to keep going back to what you saw and the seeds that were planted.
Mhm.
Okay, God, if you began a good work, then you will bring it to completion.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think in particular, stories are powerful. So much of God's revealing himself to his people were through the stories of what had happened to them. The story of Noah and the flood, the story of Abraham and Sarah, living in this land as strangers. And after 25 years, God giving them a baby, the story of Joseph.
Yeah.
These are the stories that Jochebed told her little boy Moses, telling him, you are one of God's people and God has a big purpose for you. One day, honey, you're going to pack up and we're going to move you to that palace. And you're going to live with Pharaoh, and he doesn't believe in God. But I want you to remember you do belong to God, and we are God's people. And to some extent, all of us send our kids out into the big world.
Yes. At some point, we all have to do it.
Yes, hostile toward God. Stories are powerful. So if you're a mom and you have a little one, you still have time to teach them these stories. I mean, I think you should teach them this very story, the story of Moses and how God protected him. Teach your little boy, your little girl, as you're driving in the car, as you're taking a walk, as you're feeding them breakfast, teach them these stories, especially when they're scared. I think this is a great story to turn to when your little one is scared, like scared of crocodiles, scared of evil kings, scared of what's happening out in the world. Like, what if we told them the story of Moses?
Absolutely. What a gift that God's word isn't just all these commandments, which is part of it. But like you said, that he gave us stories and stories that a child can understand when we take the time to teach them.
Yeah. And as I've said multiple times on this podcast, a story is, I think of it like a little velvet pouch filled with theological gems, truths about God. It's filled with theology, but the story is what packages it up. It's like, it's the little velvet pouch. It's easier to store these truths when we package them in stories. We can retrieve them. We can give them to others. Our kids can hide them away in their hearts. They can remember these stories.
Yes.
And so I think in this particular story, we're seeing God's faithfulness, God's protection. God is near. What are some of the false narratives that this story corrects? Like, what are the things that we tend to believe that aren't true about God or ourselves?
So much of the world's belief, fate.
Yeah, fate.
Luck, as we said, the universe lining up.
Yeah.
The church, I'm seeing a lot of talk about manifesting.
Yes.
Speaking it, believing it, and like we're going to manifest it. Well, I'm sorry, we are not that powerful. We are not the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We are not the great I am, but we know the one who is.
Yeah.
That's who we look to and release these things to. The false narrative that we are in charge of things that we're not.
Yeah, I keep hearing that word manifest. It's like a popular word right now. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly the root of that, but I agree with you. Like, we are not that powerful. Jochebed would not have told you, I am manifesting my baby's future. No, she was probably terrified, which we are too. We're not the source of the power. God is the source.
Absolutely. We have the faith of a mustard seed. He takes that.
Yes. There is an interaction between our act of faith and God's provision. Hebrews 11 lists out all of these by faith, by faith, by faith. And there are things that people actively did because of what they believed. And God wrote the rest of the story in each instance. This is one of them in Hebrews 11. There's two opposing false narratives. One is that it's hopeless. Nobody's in control. The other one is, well, I have to take control. And neither of them really quite get it right, do they?
No, it's extremes. And it's like the evil one. He always wants us to fall for an extreme.
Yes, he does.
Because it doesn't matter which side you fall off on if you fall off, right?
Right.
So you're not in the biblical balance of truth. It's going to create havoc in your life.
Yeah, either throw up your hands in despair, I can't do anything about this, or white knuckle your way through life. Like, I have to control every detail. In this instance, throwing up her hands in despair, Jochebed would have never tried anything with the ark. The little basket, I'm calling it an ark. And if she was white knuckling it, she would have never put him in the bulrushes. We don't see either of those extremes. We see her walking the line of what can I do? What do I have control over? I can make a little basket. I can cover it with pitch and tar. I can place my baby in the basket, and I can set my daughter to watch over.
Mm-hmm.
And now, God, I am trusting you with the outcomes.
Absolutely.
One other false narrative I see in this story is God is distant and unaware. He's forgotten me. We talked about how hundreds of years have gone by, and no doubt God's people wondered, like, is God going to keep his promises to us? We are slaves. God promised that he would bless those who bless us and curse those who curse us. And that is not happening right here. He's not blessing us, and he is not cursing Pharaoh, but he's about to. This is just the beginning of the story. So I think holding on and remembering that even if it looks like God is distant and unaware, looks like he's forgotten us, he hasn't.
Yeah.
At the end of this very chapter that we're talking about, Exodus 2:24 says that God remembered his people. That word remembered in the Hebrew doesn't mean just he calls to mind. It means he's about to do something about it.
Absolutely.
And he is about to do something.
And like you said, with Ishmael, he heard his cries, and God heard the cries of his people.
Yes.
Another false narrative is, deism, that God created the world and then just we're off to do whatever we want. And it's up to us, as we talked about. And whatever you want to call it, it's not believing that there is a sovereign God controlling the universe.
Yeah. That he's close enough to keep watch over a little basket in some bulrushes.
Yes.
Right? He's close enough to hear a baby's cry, and yet big enough to manage the whole world at once. He is so amazing. And this story shows us that. So, Cheryl, how can we live like this story is true?
Like we've talked about, be Jochebed, believe that God is at work behind the scenes, and be obedient, as you talked about, teaching our children, believing that when we plant those seeds, it's up to God to bring the growth, and to keep doing it when maybe we're not seeing the fruit.
Yeah.
Continue to pray. We can be behind the scenes praying,
Yeah.
and just trusting. There's a popular saying that a mother is only as happy as her saddest child. I don't know. I think that's a false narrative.
Yeah.
Joy and sorrow can coexist. We've got to believe that and live that Lord, whatever is happening with my child, I have you, and I can continue in that relationship with you, and I can have the joy of the Lord at the same time that my heart might be breaking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. I think living like it's true for me is telling others these stories. This podcast is me living like it's true. Like, this story matters. And I'm encouraging our listeners, go tell somebody this story. That's what Jochebed did. God made a way for her baby to grow up in her home under the protection of the evil king. Like, there's so much irony. But she was faithful. She told Moses these stories. I think living like it's true is holding on to these stories, remembering that they're true, and doing what I can do, separating out what I can and cannot control, and trusting God with the rest.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you so much, Cheryl. This has been a fabulous conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Can I just remind you that each of these stories from the Bible is absolutely true. Rather than giving us a list of facts to memorize about himself, God gave us a book filled with stories, and each one helps us to know him and to understand this overarching story that we are all in. So I hope that you'll take some time looking at this story in your Bible. To help you study, I've put together my free Live Like It's True workbook, which includes my false narratives watch list, my story elements bookmark, and more. Live Like It's True is part of the Resound Podcast Network. For more gospel-centered resources, visit resoundmedia.cc. We've got that link for you, along with links to any of the other resources that we've mentioned in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining me, and now it's time to go live like it's true.